joined here by two people that will introduce them here shortly. I'm going to act as the moderator, the timekeeper, and keep the discussion going. As we've been talking about this, we want this to be more of a discussion. So if you have questions, raise your hand. We'll get to you when they have a break in there. We're not going to hold the questions till the end. We've got about 49 minutes left in this discussion that we're going to have with you guys here. So just as a quick gauge so we know where to point this conversation towards, how many people in here are in the hospitality or beverage industry? How many? Okay. Yeah. We know that's accurate because, oh, yeah, yep. So would it be fair to say how many else would be what you would call yourselves as like educated consumers? All right. Or working on being educated consumers. That's going to help kind of gauge where the wealth of knowledge up here starts to talk to some of the points. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how they got into this.
Hello, my name is Jay Jackson Beckham. Folks in the industry tend to just call me Dr. J. I am that good at basketball. Not really. I came into the craft beer industry as a happy and educated consumer, probably about 20 years ago now. And then was the type of consumer who went in both feet at a time and really quickly went in, tastings, festivals, started home brewing. And by the time I got to graduate school to start working on my PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I got a job at a homebrew shop, and so was managing a homebrew shop for several years. When it came time to determine what I wanted to write my doctoral dissertation research on, I was going back and forth through lots of things, but realized that craft beer is what I was paying attention to all the time. I was drinking a lot of it and learning a lot about it and running a homebrew shop. We started a festival called Homebrew for Hunger where we were raising money and food for folks in the area. And so, I kept asking my dissertation advisor, can I write my dissertation about beer? And he was like, absolutely not. Right? And so finally, around 2008, we had this little financial crisis problem in the U.S. And I started noticing that at the time, craft beer was an industry that wasn't acting like it was supposed to. It was actually diversifying, more and more firms instead of consolidating, and people were buying more beer and paying more for it in the midst of the largest financial crisis since the Great Depression. And so for me, I was like, you know what, something is happening with the economies of value when it comes to this product. And then once I started talking about in that way, folks in my academic department were like, oh, okay, yeah. So I started writing academic work about culture around craft beer, and one of the issues that I specifically talked about a lot was disparities of people in the industry, both as consumers and producers. So gender, race, class, and really started thinking through questions of value and culture and difference with craft beer being the tool. So fast forward several years, I was giving a talk at the North Carolina Brewers Guild about diversity in craft beer, and I ran into Julia Hertz, who is the craft beer program director at the Brewers Association. And she was asking me a lot of funny questions at the time. I didn't really understand what was going on. But I got a call a couple months later asking if I wanted to work with the Brewers Association on their inclusion, equity, diversity initiatives. So as of not this past April, but the April prior, I became the Brewers Association's first diversity ambassador. And in this position, I travel around the country talking most frequently to brewers guilds, which are kind of state organizations where brewers organize, to help talk about diversifying both on the consumer side and on the employment side. We're also doing some research and collecting some data in the industry, writing best practice resources, and creating some exciting initiatives to kind of help extend the industry and the opportunities that it generally provides to groups of people who are not generally or not yet associated with craft beer.
Awesome.
I'm Katie Wallace, a huge fan of Dr. J, and have really enjoyed working with her over the last year or so. But so I'm the director of social and environmental impact at New Belgium Brewing up the road in Fort Collins, Colorado. I think I worked at a craft beer bar in college, and so that's how I got turned on to all the cool stuff and to Fat Tire and the many others that were coming out at the time. Against I was studying economics and finance because I thought you had to do what you're good at and not what you love to do at that time. And against the advice of all of my business professors, I didn't get a job right out of college. I went to Australia to pursue my lifelong dream of being over there and scuba diving and surfing, and ended up getting a job at a farm-to-table restaurant, which is where I really learned about how communities that build themselves around the ingredients and the rhythms of that area were really rich and really exciting. And so I came back to the United States and had some other plans, but kind of accidentally got this amazing job at New Belgium like 15 years ago. And I thought, no, I'm going to stick to my plan. But I came out for an interview, walked in the door, and I thought, there's just something really magical here. And at the time, I don't think I could really explain what it is. I knew we were employee owned. I knew we were wind powered. Obviously, we shared some values. So I just embarked upon that and got a job doing some kind of like communications and accounting stuff. But then I was really just wanting to work in sustainability this whole time. Like I really wanted to go back to what I experienced in Byron Bay in Australia and get back closer to these rhythms and try to bring them, into the world a bit more. So I volunteered with the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, started the Eat Local, Grow Local program, and one of our local nonprofits, and eventually actually got my job in sustainability a few years later at New Belgium. So I've been there for 15 years now, and it's been a really fun thing to work on and just see Kim Jordan, who was our co-founder, who was a social worker prior to starting the brewery, really weave these ethos of equality and justice and sustainability into a business model before that was even something that people realized you could do. And 10, 15 years ago, all I was saying up on stage was like, hey, you can do this. And it's very cool now to see a lot of the movements pushing forward within craft beer and other businesses and food. I was a huge fan of Slow Food Nation when that book came out and learned a lot about the movement. And we really thought about how we weave these into a business in a way that's going to be sustainable for the business, equitable for society, and responsible towards the environment. So today in our social and environmental impact programs, we focus on climate action. We kind of asked ourselves, like, what are the biggest issues facing the world right now, and which one of those are relevant to beer? And then where are we uniquely positioned to make a difference? So a lot of people out there are doing a lot of great work these days, which is so cool to see what's evolved in the last decade. But where can we make a unique contribution and do something that other people can't? And so we focus on climate action. We do a lot of policy work because we do think the government has a role to support or protect our shared resources like water and land and to preserve access and opportunity for Americans. And somehow when we walk into a policymaker's office, like you just start talking about beer. I work at a brewery, and they're like, oh, they relax a little bit and go into the beer zone. So it's been a really great opportunity to get more active in that space. We do a lot of land and water protection work to protect our supply chains and what makes our beer possible. And then we also get quite involved these days in social equity. As an employee-owned company, we look a lot at wealth equity, the distribution of wealth, and also diversity and inclusion. We work specifically in craft beer around gender and racial and ethnic diversity and inclusion.
Awesome. So we're just going to walk back for a few seconds before getting to some of the other things here, because I think that slow food and craft beer have kind of been on these parallel tracks for many years, but not always aware of each other or talking. And you alluded to a lot of it just now at first, but let's kind of broaden it a little bit more. Some at New Belgium, and then Dr. J, for you a little bit more in industry-wide. When did you see all of this starting to change, and where did you see the community of brewers coming together to do this?
Sure. So I think, we started in 1991, And I think just given the ethos of our founders, we started doing that then. And so it was just really from the beginning. Our co-founders took a hike in Rocky Mountain National Park and said, here are some things that matter to us as humans. We don't think a business should operate by a separate set of moral guidelines. So before they sold their first beer, they said they believed in making world-class beers and promoting beer culture and the responsible enjoyment of beer. Having our roots in the Belgian tradition of brewing lent itself really nicely to this idea that beer is not just for chugging, which was a novel idea in 1991, and that it can actually be enjoyed and be enjoyed with food, and it's a really wonderful experience. And there's a lot of heritage in it. And then we also had environmental stewardship as one of our core values and having fun. And so I think that today those have blossomed into 10 core values, but they really, at our very roots, that's who we are still. And we have a strong, I think, understanding of the interconnectedness of the health of people, the prosperity of our communities, and the health of the environment and our economic vitality. And so getting back into a rhythm with that was something that, from the very beginning, I think that we strove towards. But it was, I think, just in the last 10 years where we started to see a lot of momentum pick up. Although I would say that's when craft beer itself picked up to be more mainstream. But prior to that, craft brewers are sitting there. We're sitting next to our rivers that provide the water for our beer. Like, we are in our communities. We are the living room, the gathering place for our communities. So I think the community inherently understood, the community of brewers understood the value of community itself and how to protect it and foster it. So it's been very cool to see craft beer itself become a little bit more prominent, and therefore these values a bit more mainstream.
I would say I think it was always there when I came to craft beer, and just has kind of grown, this kind of ethos has grown exponentially, over the last 10, 15 years. But I think one of the things that has maybe primed the pump for craft beer to kind of have this sort of ethos and this operate in this way is that there weren't a lot of tools or infrastructure in place for brewing at a small scale, right? If you think about the way that the beer industry in the United States kind of came out of Prohibition in the late 1930s and then moved up through the 1980s, we were at a time where, AB had a 50 share at one point where they were selling half of the beer domestically. And there really wasn't a great infrastructure for creating a business on this scale. So when we talk about the kind of early pioneers of craft beer, they are literally people who had to weld their equipment together, right? Because equipment of that scale didn't exist. So when you have an industry that kind of starts with a backdrop of just highly industrialized, terrible product, honestly, and has to be creative out of necessity, I just think that creativity stayed in, whether it went towards having an environmental mission, toward having a strong social mission, toward pursuing pairing with food. There was always just kind of this narrative that, well, we can't do it the way those folks are doing it, so we might as well do it the way we want to do it. And I think the more that got in place and the more that brewers kind of came together and shared knowledge and kind of shared their resources, it just accelerated, right? Those of you who, live near and visit a craft brewery, I'm willing to guess that you may have tasted a collaboration beer, which was made by one or more brewery. And that isn't just a gimmick, right? Craft beer was one of the most collaborative industries from the outset. And I hear all sorts of great stories about, like my glycol chiller broke and blah, blah, blah down the road, just drove over here to go grab some stuff and put, so it really continues to be a community based industry and people who are engaged with their communities around them. And it's remarkable that you see a brewery maybe producing 500 barrels a year, which sounds like a lot, but is almost no beer. And a brewery like New Belgium, and they're still kind of operating with the same values intact and still impacting their local communities in similar ways.
And maybe, oh, go ahead.
I live in North County here,
Yeah.
Western Colorado, their stuff, even the fruit beers and all that, they just created that new cherry. Just because this year we had a whole lot of cherries. There's a new brewery opened up that does sour beers, and they are trying to do it in the Belgian style in the sense that everything that they use is from our North Fork Valley. And it was very interesting to see how the owners of, it's called a pub, Aonia United Brewing, how they were so supportive of the other one, and that, again, that sense of community. They don't see themselves as competition. They see like brothers in arms, if you will, in producing what they have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was like a good sense of like all these people were in it together. Like they didn't come in the early days. You weren't making money brewing. You were just doing your craft and your art and what you were passionate about. And today it's definitely like, with bigger brewers buying the little brewers and investors investing in breweries. I think that has shifted. You see a little bit of a diversification of that energy, but I think there's still plenty of amazing work and a lot of storytelling. Like those collaboration beers are stories that we track over the years. Like so and so brought this barrel to our brewery, and we brought it to them, and then they brought it to them. And there's still a really strong legacy of tradition and camaraderie in that.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, building on that, do you think with that sense of collaboration there comes a level of accountability that brewers are allowed to hold other brewers accountable if they're not like upholding sustainable standards and stuff like that?
So there's I have a good friend named Colin. He's a co-owner of a brewery called Hen House out in Petaluma, California, and he has this tweet chain on Twitter that's been going. He just retweets his own tweet, but he does it every day, and it just says, "Take responsibility for your beer." And he's been doing it for I don't know how long now, but he's a huge proponent of this idea that every brewery has, if not a mission, at least a purpose, and that fulfilling that purpose, at least in his mind, has something to do with being accountable to people in your community and your suppliers. So, he might mean like if your beer is not as good as you think it is, dump it. Or if you think you're not like impacting your community in the way you want to, slow down and figure out how to do it. But I love that sentiment because I think it kind of explodes what we mean when we say beer and craft beer. Because one of the things I walk around saying all the time is there's no such thing as just beer. Right? Like beer is an accumulation of culture, history, and labor, and community. Like, right? It's much more than just like product in the glass. And so I think when someone like Colin says take responsibility for your beer, I think he means take responsibility for your community, take responsibility for how you operate, take responsibility for who you buy from. And I think that's at its core maybe what makes craft beer as wonderful as it is.
From the Brewers Association side of it, I'm going to use you guys as a good example of it too. It absolutely is happening. And one of the most expensive parts of being a brewery is actually the lab and the testing equipment. And one of the things that hurts the industry as a whole is anybody who cans, bottles, or sells bad beer, and then somebody who's never had beer before goes and has that, and they're like, "This is disgusting. I'm going back to Sauvignon Blanc." But you have these breweries, these leaders of the industry, like New Belgium has done this, Sierra Nevada has done this, where they've shared the knowledge of their. I don't even know what the price tag on your lab is, or any of the large brewers' labs. I mean, they're insanely amazing, and they've shared that knowledge with other brewers. When this whole hazy IPA craze came out, New Belgium actually had one of their lead, almost chemists, join in with two of the other people on hazy beers to actually figure out what the scientific reasoning was behind it and to make it so that it was actually proper and correct. And they just shared that knowledge. But that's one of the leadership things you see of that holding people accountable or taking people accountable and coming through with that is that ability for a lot of them to not look at it as competition, is to look at it as like as just a large industry of people who do things together. So I was going to jump off of that and go into Now, with the majority of this room identifying themselves as consumers, some of them educated, some of them not, how, as a consumer, do you learn to support and identify and even encourage other either breweries or companies that aren't part of this, that are either aware of the change that's going on or that? How do you get involved? How do you recognize it? And what can they do as consumers to help see this continue to grow?
I think, well, right now we're talking about a session at the next Craft Brewers Conference on like all of the certifications and labels and what the hell do they mean? Because there's just that proliferation of information right now. And like a big part of the trick is understanding what means something and what doesn't. Because we get approached, I think we will probably decline 99% of certifications that we're approached to earn because we don't think they mean much. And anyone can get them, and so we've really focused on things like B Corp certification that really talks about it's a broad, overreaching assessment of how well your company benefits community, coworkers, and the environment, and to what degree this is all integrated in your governance and your bylaws and whatnot. And so it's kind of like fair trade organic, but like for companies' practices. And that is really rigorous. It's extremely rigorous, in fact. And most people who go through that free assessment online will probably learn something about what they could be doing in their business. But most of them don't make the cut. So if you do see that B with a circle around it, I think that's a great one. And then, of course, like Salmon Safe is really germane, I think, to this conversation. Salmon Safe hops in the Northwest help to protect salmon habitat, but in so doing, they decrease pesticides and other chemicals and use better like integrated pest management and whatnot. And so there are a couple of things like that. We do non-GMO verification, but we've just gone through it to make sure we don't go through the certification, but we've gone through the practices, but we haven't actually gotten certified. But just we use them a lot of ways for our own information. But I think that it is really hard right now. There's a lot of even you can talk about environmental, a lot of greenwashing that's out there. A lot of companies get more credit than the companies who are actually doing it, and they're not doing as much. I think that right now there's a lot of like pride washing and diversity washing that's happening among brands overall. I think in general, not 100%, but most craft breweries are pretty good about being real about it. But I think that, I don't know. You can speak to that. Yeah, no, I'm being generous. I'm trying to think. Compared to the percentage of companies in other industries, maybe.
Right. They're not like selling Pride paper clips or
right.
whatever.
Yeah. But I don't know. It's still, there is still quite a bit to learn, I think. And there's, I think, not an easy way as a customer to go out and say, this is how I vet what I'll purchase. And so, but I do think that choosing like one issue at a time, like that exercise we went through as a company of saying, what are the biggest issues facing in the world? Which ones are relevant to beer? And which ones are we most uniquely positioned in to make a difference? And then we selected like 3 categories from that. Like in our home with my family, we've done that too. Like what are the big issues that the world is facing? Which ones do we care about most? Which are most relevant to our lives? And then from there, just getting, is it agriculture and soil? Then getting really nerdy about that and finding out who the companies are that are leading some of these things. Or is it, we have like Dr. Bronner's in the room who really pushes for a fair minimum wage, right? So are there figuring out what causes really matter to you, and then picking 1 or 2 or maybe 3, going deep in those, and then maybe once you've mastered that, move on to the next thing. But it's pretty overwhelming. You can understand it.
So I got a question. In terms of producers and farmers that this is related to certification. Sometimes they'll go through the certification process as a marketing tool to say, like they go to the farmers markets around here and say that set up their stands and you see they're certified organic, and for the consumers and say, oh, okay, I can trust these. Is there, and then in our valley, there are a number of people that don't want to go through that process of getting certified because it can't, to them, it may be onerous and they just don't have the time or the willpower to go through all that. So is there have you seen, like, in terms of consumers, I never even thought about this, but I think until you mentioned certification, you have consumers coming up, are you aware of any consumers who saying, gee, I'd like to have a certified beer?
Yes.
Really?
Yes,
Yeah, like all
absolutely.
the time. And so many certifications, and none of them really that good, I don't think. And so, but I think, I mean, that's, yeah, you know, for when I go to the farmers market, I know my farmers, and so I don't care if they're certified. I think certification is kind of to give you that trust and feeling if you haven't visited the place or don't know the people. But you know, there's certainly an opportunity for it. It's just that it's really expensive to verify everything, and so there's a number of hurdles with certifications. I think I would rather, in some ways they've been really helpful. I'd rather people focus on the systemic solutions to this, and which happens through, yeah. Well, anyway, it gets really complex depending on what issue you're focused on. But like not making the customers do all the work necessarily, but the customers pushing the companies and the regulations to do the work.
Yeah, and just to echo something Katie said, 85% of Americans over the age of 21 live within 10 miles of a craft brewery. So, you know, the first thing I would say, if you want some craft beer, it's cool to go to the grocery store, but it's even cooler to go to the brewery. And the added advantage is you can talk to the brewers once you're there. And this idea that like you can kind of think like, what is the issue that's important to me, and then can I talk through that issue with my brewer? I think that's a really wise way to go. I'll give you an example. I'm really interested in agriculture, in particular sourcing ingredients, and so a lot of people don't know that hops, you know, there's lots and lots of different strains. Some of them are proprietary, and so companies own those genetics, and they're a little bit more expensive. And there are also a fair number of open source hops. The Brewers Association supports development of open source hops through grant monies. And so if I see two IPAs in front of me, I tend to choose the one that's made with open source hops because I think that's an interesting choice, right? Same thing with barley production in the United States. There are a growing number of craft maltsters who are growing and malting barley for craft beer and craft spirits. It's an uphill battle for them because the product they're trying to grow is labor intensive and will draw lots more money on the bushel than like a really large 2-row that people are growing like on half of Canada, right, and importing into the United States. So if I can talk to a local craft maltster and say, okay, who do you provide malt to? Then that's a purchase that I'd like to make now. Because one of the gorgeous things is with over 7,000 craft breweries in the US, you have lots of choices. Right? And you, with a small amount of work, you can make the choices that kind of fit your value system as far as a consumer.
I'll get back to you 1 second.
So you mentioned supply chain and in general, like having kind of a robust social and environmental sustainability program, especially making some choices that make your brewery more sustainable. Those choices cost money, and normally it is breweries that are larger, like say the Bad and Goblin, that are able to afford those, to make those kind of choices. Can you speak to how smaller craft brewers are able to move towards that, or you know, how those barriers could potentially
I think there are certain things, like for example, when New Belgium was in the basement back in like 1991, we had actually a heat exchanger on top of the brew kettle. So people often say like, oh, I'll make more investments in sustainability like once I get more money and get going. But there are actually a lot of like scrappy solutions that are the roots of the craft brewing industry of like Dr. J said, piecing these things together. That if you're thinking through that lens, that they can be applied. So we had, like for example, a brew kettle releases all the steam. We put over that a tin trash can that captured the steam, and within that we had a copper coiled pipe that was had incoming water going through it, and it was using that steam to preheat the water for the next batch. And this was all in the basement in this like hand-built thing. And so today we have this big manufactured heat exchanger at the top of our brew kettle, but it is something that we've been doing since we were in the basement. So I think that there are a lot of like funny solutions if people are thinking creatively in that. It's a bit harder in the supply chain. Like for brewers, we have kind of a hourglass supply chain. So because we buy, hops are only during like a week of the year can you have fresh, wet hops, but usually they have to be processed to some degree, and they at least go through a picker, or they go through a kiln, and sometimes powderized and pelletized. So then there's like the processing on it. So we typically buy from brokers, not from growers. And then same thing with barley. You have barley that's grown on the field, but then it actually has to be malted for brewing. So it has to be sprouted and go in the kiln and dried. And the number of brokers and processors are very small, but the number of growers are quite large, and of course the brewers are quite large. So it's very difficult for even New Belgium, being one of the larger craft brewers, to make any impact in our supply chain in that way. And I think that most small breweries, they're like, how do I pay the bills? How do I make this beer? How do I clean the bathroom? How do I get do good for my community? And how can I save a little energy? And like the idea of like how do I source barley? Like that's like number like 27 on the list. And so, but I do think that that's where the industry association can be really helpful. And so I would say like a local brewer who wants to have better sourcing practices across the supply chain in general would want to say, hey, Brewers Association, what are you doing to help our industry protect the integrity of our ingredients and push for more sustainably grown and harvested ingredients?
And I would say for even small operations, one of the cool things being one of the ambassadors for the Brewers Association is that I kind of run these weird circles with all the other ambassadors. So we have a safety ambassador, sustainability,
To sustainability.
but also just quality. And whenever we're in the same place in the same time, we kind of like do that thing and realize, how similar what we're talking about. But I've sat down with a couple of our sustainability guys, and some of the things that are, that they put together in their best practice resources and that they present when they're out to the guild are things that any brewery can do of any size. And it's really pretty amazing how the association has just collected all of these things from like one of the biggest ways people can make an impact is reducing the amount of water they use and being efficient about their brewing is very water intensive. And so thinking both about how your water use works and your wastewater, that's something that every brewery can think about. And one of the coolest things about kind of these sustainable additions are, things like light switches that turn off automatically when you're not in the bathroom. These are things that end up saving your brewery money, almost all of them. So that's another kind of cool thing that I see, like in terms of small businesses. Just anecdotally, I think craft brewers seem to have put more best practices in more areas in place for their small businesses than I see in other places. And I'm sure that's the impact of the association, the state guilds, and again, this kind of ethos of sharing.
I think it's a myth that it's too expensive to do the right thing. Like even with salmon safe hops, for example, when that came out, hop farmers that we visited were like, I'm actually saving money on this. And so then that started to spread farmer to farmer because they were spending less on chemical inputs and fertilizers and synthetic fertilizers and so they really started to see even more productivity from the soil with those methods as well. And so today, I think it's estimated that about 40% of hops are all salmon safe certified. A lot of times you would never even know it because that's just the best practice. So those are the solutions where I'm talking about like addressing things at the systemic level. Like what are those things that also make sense economically and environmentally and socially? And so I think there are a number of solutions, although there is a very real shortcoming. Like once you've gotten all the low-hanging fruit, it's like, yeah, the next thing I can do is spend $10 million on that thing, and that's not going to happen.
Yeah, on the association side of it too, some of the large stuff that happens, and one of the bigger ones that happened and is actually a push right now is the craft beverage modernization and tax reform bill that got passed a few years ago. That bill saved it reduced the tax on every barrel of beer a brewer brewed. Actually worked with Big Beer on that one. It actually helped wine. It went multi-industry on it. It's up again to hopefully become permanent. But we heard back from almost every single brewery that the money that they saved on that went back into hiring staff, infrastructure, best practices. It went right back into the business. Majority of it went into hiring somebody so that then the owner could focus on what the next plan was. So on an association level, we have a lot of those kind of things that you know one person may not be able to do as an individual business, but with over 5,000 members as an association, it can be a larger voice. You had a question over here.
Yeah, I have two questions. So one is structural. For slow food chapters, how do we not duplicate the work of the Brewers Association and support this collaboration? That sounds like it's really natural in the industry, but things like open source hop development or supporting craft maltsters, like what's the role for local chapters that you would see that isn't duplicative but supportive of advancing EDI initiatives or sustainability or other kinds of community-focused efforts in the industry? So that's one.
I'll stop you there. We'll go one
Okay.
and then come back to two? Or is two tied in?
It's tied in.
Okay, go.
So I'm interested beyond New Belgium and Sierra Nevada, who you mentioned. Who are the leaders at least in the U.S., who you love and admire and drink, so that we can be supporting you all with our dollars. So supporting structurally and then supporting with our dollars.
Yeah. So to your first question, if I were in that position, I would probably start by just going to brewersassociation.org and looking at the Brewers Association website, looking in our best practice areas. There's tons of free information there, and you'll kind of see everything from legislative affairs to sustainability work to safety and quality to diversity and inclusion. So you just kind of get a good idea of kind of what the scope of the association is. And then I would actually suggest that you get in touch with your state Brewers Guild. San Diego actually has its own guild, a city guild, and talk to the folks that are close to you. Though the state guilds are not officially under the Brewers Association, they're all heavily supported by the Brewers Association. We work through the guild structure a lot. So I would certainly kind of start there and see what folks are doing already, and then kind of see what you can build out from that way. But those sources are already there. The craft maltsters actually have a guild, an association themselves. So I would look at the Craft Maltster Association. They have a really great craft maltster finder on their website, so you can find a craft maltster if there's one in your area. So that's another really solid resource. And then as far as folks who I think are doing excellent work, honestly, the cool thing is there's like so many that I don't know if I could like really make a list, and one of another great thing is that like sometimes you don't even know, right? And that's the cool thing about craft beer as well, that like lots of these things brewers have just been kind of doing them in the background. The first time I went up to Fort Collins and visited New Belgium, I was aware of like, yeah, they did some stuff, but like until I got the kind of extended tour, I was like, I was like, I want a job here when I left, because it's just extensive, right?
And we moved to Colorado.
That would be horrible. But the amount, it's just everyday practices, Same thing when I went to Allagash in Portland, Maine. Just thinking about the way they work and the way they work with their employees, the way they kind of stick to their value structure as far as the production and distribution of beer. That's really interesting. You have a brewery like Jester King out of Austin, who's making all wild fermentations, so inoculating their beers with, local yeasts. They have a farm there, a teaching farm. They have goats. So if you want sour beer and goats, a farm-to-table restaurant. So they're really just kind of all over the place, and that's really, really exciting. The Brewers Association has our independent seal. And that's not a certification. It's simply made available to brewers who qualify as an independent craft brewer, meaning you're not more than 25% owned by another entity that's not also a craft brewer, and you make less than 6 million barrels a year. That's a little upside down bottle that says independent. So I always say that's a really easy place to start doing your research. And a lot of our membership in the Brewers Association is getting some mileage out of being able to distinguish, hey, we're independently owned, we're small and local. Why not stop here?
Just to add, I ditto everything Dr. J said. And then there on the websites too, on the resource hub on the Brewers Association website, each category you go into, you'll also see an email address for those ambassadors that Dr. J mentioned. So if you are curious about quality or sustainability or diversity and inclusion, like you can actually get email addresses to those ambassadors there. B Corp, I think there are something like 23 B Corp breweries right now, which I think are always going to be willing to have some type of conversation like that. And then the other place that is just a really beautiful synergy with the Slow Food Group is just anyone who's doing beer dinners.
Yeah.
Like if you're a brewery, not every brewery is into that. But if you're a brewery that's working, if you have a brewer that's working with chefs to make dinners, like that brewer is going to have a strong passion typically for the world of food, where it comes from, all of the ethos of slow food that slow food purports. And so the Cicerone certification also is kind of like a sommelier for beer. And so you get certified for knowing a lot about the sensory attributes of that. I think within that community of Cicerones, you'll find chefs and brewers that are really passionate in that space. And typically, what I found in that, I don't know if the same is true for you, but that people who are doing that stuff are like caring where things come from, and so and they get really excited about working with local seasonal ingredients too.
Awesome. So, question's still in there. We've got about 10 minutes left in this. Kind of the final thing I wanted to wrap up on this is what's the next step? Where is this going next? And let's kind of shorten it to 5 to maybe 10 years. But what's the next thing that the consumers are gonna see happening in this in the craft beer industry? What's the next kind of change that's coming around that everybody's focusing on, or that you're focusing on at New Belgium, that you want people to know about?
I'll start. So what's the big change? So for me, one of the reasons why I do the work I do is because I, one, love beer, but two, because I have seen over and over again the opportunities that beer open up for entrepreneurship, for people to pursue professional development and education, for communities to get together, and for philanthropy. It's one of the things we haven't talked about much today, but like craft brewers do a crazy amount of philanthropy. Whether they're helping local communities or whether they're associated with charities. I'm sure you all saw the Resilience IPA effort that raised all that money for the campfire victims. So for me, I'm interested in craft beer as a product, but I'm also interested in it as a tool. And so right now, the biggest opportunity that I see in craft beer is one, to shift our demographics, right? Right now, as far as consumers, only 31% of craft beer consumers are women. Far fewer are owners. Only 4% of craft beer drinkers are African American, as opposed to 12, 13% of the population. Almost none are owners. And so with a product in an industry that has so much potential to build communities and build individual people and their trajectory, I want to see the benefits get their way to more people, right? To more neighborhoods, to more individuals, to more young people, to more retired people, because right, this is already America's most consumed alcoholic beverage, right? It's already highly embedded into our history and our social practices and everything we do. So I want to make sure the benefits, right, of this industry and this social formation are equitably distributed around the United States. And so for me, that's the horizon of the next 5-10 years, or at least that's what I'll be doing. So.
Yeah, I think ditto on that. It's, I think craft beer somehow ended up with the statistics that Dr. J shared, but I think that the community itself wants to change that. And so, and it just is a lack of awareness that Dr. J is actually transforming rapidly right now, and many others in that space. And so, so I'm really excited about that. I mean, and also just the creativity that comes from different cultural backgrounds that will come into craft beer, and we'll start seeing things that maybe don't even look like beer looks like today. Just these. I know we did a collaboration with Primus, a brewery in Mexico City, and it's inspired by agua fresca. It doesn't even taste like beer. It's one of my favorite things. That Mural is the name of it. I think there's going to be more things like that. It'll be really fun. I think there's a lot of playfulness ahead in that way. And then also keeping in mind, we work a lot on wealth equity as an employee-owned company. And one of the things you see is that when a craft brewer comes into a community, that the prosperity of that community grows around it. So people who do economic development love the idea of bringing craft breweries in. However, I would say most of the time that's because it's helped to cause gentrification, and that we need to do a better job as a community of saying how do we bring existing communities along in the prosperity that a craft beer might offer a neighborhood. And so we've looked at that locally, and one of the things we're working on too. So from a sustainability perspective, I try not to cry every night. Because the impacts of climate change are actually showing up in our supply chain pretty significantly, especially with barley. Hops, it's happening, not quite as dramatically, but that's even more of a risk because they're all concentrated within 3 states in the United States. And so, but barley, we're seeing barley sprout on the field because of warm and wet harvest conditions. We're seeing drought really affect barley quality. And we're going to be getting to a point, I think, in the not so distant future where it's affecting cost and availability too.
Yeah.
You can kind of work around the quality issues to some degree for a while and compensate for that, but it's, we're nearing some dangerous zones, I think. And same thing with water sources. So, the extended drought in California caused some brewers to actually have to reduce production and then have to suspend employment of coworkers because they didn't have enough water to make beer. We have floods and hurricanes and fires, and so we're really starting to see not only disruptions in the supply but also disruptions in the marketplace, which is obviously our last concern. But when at the end of the day, but still that it impacts our businesses. And so when there's a hurricane that rips through a big market, and so I'm worried about that. But there are a lot of things that give me hope. And so I really think that more, where we were 10 years ago, like I said, when I started here 10, 15 years ago, those talks were all about hey, there's a problem. It's called climate change. And today, there's much more efforts that have been galvanized around this issue. And it's really surprising to see how much that changed in just a decade. So I know that it's still taking more time, and that will, but it is still moving at a faster pace than typically you see. So I think that regenerative agriculture, the work that you guys are doing to help pay attention to the health of the land and the health of the communities as we face these challenges will benefit us as well too as a whole. But I think that we need some more systemic solutions. We're getting to kind of a point where that's necessary. So that's why we focus on policy advocacy. It's why we, as New Belgium, push the Brewers Association to be hey, can we all work together as an industry to address these barley vulnerabilities in our supply chain and whatnot. And so those are the areas that we're really focusing on. But I think that there's some hope in there for sure too.
Over there and welcome back to you.
So you keep mentioning barley production. Do you think that the industry is open to
Mm-hmm. Yep.
chips, erosion, generates
Mm-hmm.
soil, things like that? Is the industry ready for that? I know Crimson and things like that, so it take 20 to 30 years to be
Liable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, through our grants program and also the BA's grant program, we fund research for perennials and for also winter varieties. And so we brewed a beer with Patagonia, actually, the clothing company that does the food. Yeah, we did their first long root ale. And so it was the cost of Kernza though to actually, and it was such a small percentage of the actual ingredients, and the cost to put it in there was about 15 times the cost of a regular grain. And so right now it's not financially like sustainable to do that. And so, but we want to accelerate that, and there are technologies that are helping to accelerate breeding right now without introducing foreign genes that I think that are interesting to look at. But I say there are a number of craft brewers that are willing to explore that. It just needs money to get to a point where farmers and maltsters are going to be willing to explore that. They're less usually risk-taking in that way, and they have less room for mistakes. So that's also part of that reason. So, I would say that if we can get the science to a place on those crops that reduce the risk overall, get the buy-in of the maltsters and the growers, that you can see that accelerate. I still think it's realistically at least a decade out.
There are we've got a number of gluten-free breweries in the country, and a lot of them are brewing with sorghum in particular. And sorghum malt syrups are available, even for a home brewer or something like that. So there are people kind of doing that type of work, but yeah, they're it's a tough supply chain if you're working through it. But I think absolutely, right now there's a lot of really cool acceleration as far as like innovating ingredients and kind of figuring out what's what. And I can't imagine we won't go there,
Yeah.
hopefully sooner than later.
There's also, I think, a lot of excitement around breeding for aroma and taste through barley, which hasn't been thought of. When beer was all yellow beer, it's like just make this really productive barley.
Right.
And now they're looking at how you put flavor into that too, at the same time that you're helping the barley to be a little bit more resistant to the impacts of climate change and less resource intensive. But I think also part of what helps those perennial varieties and the winter varieties be more successful is a more regenerative approach to looking at soil health. And so that could accelerate that if farmers could get on board a little bit more on a broader scale with the benefits of regenerative agriculture.
Colorado actually has the first gluten-free malt house too, up outside of Fort Collins, grass malting.
Yeah.
She malts quinoa, corn, and a whole range of other grains. She will not malt barley, but it's all very small production. And I agree with the intent of that.
Yeah, so I work in food waste reduction, and so there's in Denver, for example, there's a beer outlet in the area, and it's a collaboration with a food rescue organization where we're using bread that would otherwise go to waste, and then thinking further, there's some breweries that are using waste and grain to pigs. How are breweries kind of incorporating waste so that at the front end, that you maybe think about collaborations like the Penn Mortar into production, and then at the end, how are they making sure that that is going back into schools? And is that scaling up at all?
So, a couple of different things. So, as we're talking about, to barley as a major ingredient, it's like heavy and wet and soggy when you get rid of it. But it's a fairly good source of crude protein. I feed it to my chickens. And a lot of people, figure out how to mill it and make flours out of it. So you see it in pizza crust and things like that. But I think because taking away spent grain, it's actually kind of onerous. A lot of breweries have found ways to find somebody who wants it, who sometimes will even come get it. At the very least, it makes good compost. So I think that's one kind of waste issue that's pretty well established in the brewing industry as well. Although I've seen some really creative extensions of that. There's a little organization up in Cincinnati, I think, that takes spent grain, and then they have a bakery that makes dog treats, and the bakery employs all the employees have intellectual disabilities. So they have kind of a learning curriculum, and then it's job skills, and then a lot of them, interestingly, get replaced in breweries because they work on the production side and maybe canning rooms and things. But I think people are thinking smarter about the types of resources that they've put out. Wastewater is a huge issue with breweries, how to manage it and how to deal with its impact. And again, I think a lot of breweries are coming along and figuring out kind of how to do that more sustainably. The food waste in stuff that I see, I'm seeing a lot more stuff as far as like ugly food, so stuff that won't get sold because it's not pretty enough, I guess, and people using that kind of stuff. So in ingredients as far as front end stuff, and I've heard of this bread collab, which is really interesting. And then I've seen a lot of breweries doing foraging programs now, so that if you're in a community, you're a farmer, you're a forager, you can bring in what you have, and they'll give you a fair price for it. If you have enough to do something interesting in brewing. So, I think that's, again, that kind of thinking is just going to keep, spinning around as as it gets shared within the community. And I think the possibilities are kind of limitless. On Thursday night when I got here, I had a pickle beer that was a collaboration between a brewery and a pickle place that was like dumping the brine, but I guess it was like kind of good for a goza. So, and it was delicious. Like if you've ever been that weirdo who's like at the refrigerator kind of drinking pickle juice, you would have really
We can
loved
make that
it.
a beer.
Yeah, it was really good.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. J covered most of it. I would just say that, like, so spent grain is tough because you have to, if it's going to be used as feed, it has to be delivered, it has to be ingested within 24 hours or else it can grow toxins. And so if you're a brewer that's kind of brewing a little bit here and a little bit there and you don't have a regular schedule and rhythm for that, that can be really hard because it's hard for the farm or whomever is taking it in to know when you're going to bring it in and be able to work that into their system and balance it out with the rest of the feed. So brewers that can be a little bit more consistent in their scheduling tend to have the best luck in getting it out as feed. Or I've even heard of people using it because it's sterilized, using it as substrate for growing fungi.
Yeah, mushrooms.
And so, but again, it's like a lot of attention to detail. People also grow potato sprouts in the spent grain. So but it really has to be managed from a very scientific, quality perspective and making sure that it's not causing issues to animals or to whatever you're growing. And then the other thing I would just mention is that all brewing systems are kind of different. And so like some brewing systems brew IPAs really well and some don't. Some brew fruit beers or bread beers really well and some don't. And so it's not easy for every brewer to flex. I wish that there was more of a plug and play solution for brewing equipment. Maybe that's like the next genius invention that can happen. But it is hard sometimes to flex and change your ingredients because the equipment and the processes can be very specific.
And with that, we are at time. We've been cut off there. But I believe we're going down to the first floor where we're allowed to drink beer.